In the grim darkness of the 41st millennium, there exists a chapter of Space Marines whose very existence is kept secret from the wider Imperium. They are the Grey Knights, the daemon hunters of the Adeptus Astartes, and they serve as the chamber militant of the Ordo Malleus, the branch of the Inquisition dedicated to combating the daemonic. Their fortress monastery lies hidden beneath the frozen surface of Titan, Saturn's largest moon, where they train in arts both martial and mystical. Every Grey Knight is a psyker, their minds honed into weapons against the creatures of the warp. They are humanity's secret shield against horrors that most Imperial citizens will never know exist. The halls of their fortress monastery are carved from the dark grey living stone of Titan itself, snaking deep beneath the moon's surface in layer upon layer of cells and chapels, training halls and armories, medical facilities and parade grounds. Deepest of all lie the catacombs, where every Grey Knight who has fallen in battle during the chapter's 10,000-year history rests in eternal vigilance. Their weapons are consecrated against the daemonic, their armor adorned with hexagrammic and pentagrammic wards tattooed into their very skin by the sages of the inquisitorial archives. They are ready, because their very purpose is to be ready, for when the time comes to fight the horrors of the warp, the Grey Knights are literally the Imperium's only hope. This is the story of Justicar Alaric and his battle against the daemon prince called Ghargatuloth, the Prince of 1,000 Faces. Our tale begins not in the present, but 1,000 years in the past, on a world called Corion 9. The planet had become a nightmare made manifest, its surface transformed into a heaving sea of pure evil. Far below the orbiting Imperial fleet, the land was covered in a seething forest of torture racks, crosses and squares and stars of blood-stained wood on which were broken hundreds of thousands of bodies. They were mangled and wound around the wood like vines around a cane, a huge and horrible vineyard with rows upon rows of crucified bodies spilling a terrible vintage of blood into the earth. These were the followers of Ghargatuloth, cultists and demagogues, summoned to their master's world in hope of eternal reward. Their reward was agony without end. Their bodies were trapped between life and death, exsanguinated, but their minds just lucid enough to understand their suffering. As the seasons passed, their limbs had merged with the wood that grew through them, twisting them into canopies of fleshy branches until there was barely anything human left in them save for their screaming. They said the screams could be heard from orbit. They were right. Ghargatuloth was a daemon prince of Tzeentch, the chaos god of change and sorcery. He was known by many names across the ages: the Prince of 1,000 Faces, the Forger of Hells, the Whisperer in the Darkness. His very nature was knowledge itself, and every soul he consumed, every secret he forced from his followers, made him stronger. His power was such that the Changer of Ways himself had granted Ghargatuloth a body of immense proportions, a vessel of iridescent flesh that could manifest 1,000 different faces, each one an aspect of the suffering and deception he embodied. At an unheard signal, the ground of Corion IX began to seethe. The crucified wailed even louder as iridescent, shifting creatures crawled up from beneath the earth. Some had long-reaching fingers and torsos dominated by leering, huge mauled faces. Others had bloated fungoid bodies that belched multicolored flame. There were ravenous swarms of tiny misshapen things that gnawed at the roots of the crucified forest, and immense winged monsters like huge deformed vultures that spat magical fire. Every one was a shining multicolored vision of hell, and each was just a pale reflection of their master. A tide of daemons burst from the ground and flooded through the crucified forest, shrieking in anticipation and hunger. The will of Ghargatuloth resonated through the very crust of the planet, telling his servants that the next turning point would be here. Thousands of the Change God's plots were coming to a head in this battle, a tangled nexus of fates that would set the path for the future. The Grey Knights came to Corion IX knowing they faced almost certain death. 300 of them descended through the blood-streaked clouds in drop pods, led by Grand Master Mandulis, a warrior who had fought the daemonic across 100 worlds. His battlefield reports filled volumes in the Archivum Titanis, yet in all his decades of service he had never seen anything like the horde of Ghargatuloth. He was not afraid. The Emperor himself had decreed that a space marine shall know no fear. But Mandulis' soul still recoiled at the sheer magnitude of evil spread before him. As his pod plummeted toward the nightmare surface, Mandulis recited the sacred words of his chapter: "I am the hammer. I am the right hand of my emperor, the instrument of his will, the gauntlet about his fist, the tip of his spear, the edge of his sword." The impact was immense, like slamming into a wall. The sides of the pod burst open, and a truly appalling stench of decay flooded in, so thick it was like plunging into a sea of blood. The unearthly keening of thousands of daemons filled the air like an atonal choir howling out a wall of sound. Within seconds, the daemons were upon them. Mandulis drew his nemesis sword from its scabbard, the blade leaping into life with a power field calibrated to disrupt the psychic matter of daemon flesh. The stylized golden lightning bolt set into its silver blade glowed hot with power as he cut wide arcs through the creatures clambering toward him. He felt unholy flesh part beneath his sword, heard the screaming of daemons as they dissolved back into the warp. The battle that followed was savage beyond description. The Grey Knights fought through an ocean of daemons, creatures of shimmering iridescent flesh that served Ghargatuloth's will. Terminator armor cracked under the assault. Nemesis weapons flashed silver in the corrupted light. Psy-cannons thundered, their blessed ammunition tearing through daemon after daemon. Incinerators poured gouts of holy promethium into the endless tide. One by one, the Grey Knights fell, but they never stopped advancing. Grand Master Mandulis himself led the assault on Ghargatuloth's throne. His ancient sword blazed with psychic fire as he carved through the Daemon Prince's guardians, the holocaust power of his terminators clearing the path before him. In the end, Mandulis succeeded in speaking a fragment of the daemon's true name, enough to destabilize Ghargatuloth's manifestation and banish him from the material realm. But the victory cost Mandulis his life. The effort of channeling such power burned out his soul, leaving his body an empty shell. His sword was recovered from the battlefield and returned to Titan, where it was interred in his tomb as a relic for future generations. The Grey Knights recorded his deeds in their great archives, built statues in his honor, and inscribed prophecies about when the Daemon Prince might return. The Emperor's Tarot and the visions of astropaths suggested that Ghargatuloth would be able to manifest again in 1,000 years, somewhere along a chain of worlds known as the Trail of Saint Ivissa. And now, 1,000 years later, that time has come. Justicar Alaric awoke in a recovery tank deep within the Grey Knight's fortress monastery on Titan. Clear fluid surrounded him, a concoction of the chapter's apothecaries that helped flesh heal and kept infections at bay. He felt tubes snaking all around him, feeding medicines into his veins and sending information back to the cogitators clicking and thrumming around him. Lumoglobes arranged in a circle on the stone ceiling bathed him in soft light, and in the shadows beyond, medical orderlies moved quietly between other recovery tanks and auto-surgeon tables. Alaric could feel the wounds inside him. His black carapace, the hard layer beneath the skin of his chest and abdomen, had a large ragged hole where a lasbolt had punched through. There was another hole in the meat of his thigh, with a tight channel of internal scar leading up into his abdomen. 2 of his lungs had been punctured. His body was covered in smaller scars, burns from where his armor had become red-hot under the weight of lasfire, cuts and gouges from shards of ceramite, all newly laid over the old scars from previous wounds. What troubled Alaric was not the pain, but the shame. He had fallen in battle, lost consciousness while his brothers fought on. 7 Grey Knights had died in the assault on the traitor Inquisitor Valinov's fortress, and Alaric had not been there to witness the end. He remembered dragging himself into cover as overcharged lash shots ripped into the stone floor beside him, willing his limbs to move so he could loose a last volley against the cultists who had wounded him. Then consciousness had drained into grey oblivion. Apothecary Glyvan, ancient beyond measure with bionic hands that gave him surgical precision far finer than human fingers, told Alaric that Valinov had been taken alive. The traitor sat in a cell on Mimas now, awaiting interrogation and execution. 7 Grey Knights dead, but the mission was successful. Alaric's squad had already begun the process of mourning. Brothers Encalion and Tolus had been allotted niches in the catacombs where their shrouded bodies would rest until the time came for the Emperor's servants to join him once more. Brother Litkos was undergoing intensive training with the Psy-cannon that Tolus had once carried. In time, new recruits would be picked to replace the fallen, but until then, Squad Alaric would be 2 men short as a reminder of the threats they always faced. Valinov had once been a member of the Ordo Malleus in good standing, trained by the legendary Lord Inquisitor Barbilus himself. Barbilus had been an old-school inquisitor, the kind of man sculpted into the friezes of Malleus temples and used as exemplars of righteousness. Very few survived his brutal training methods, but those who did were forged into the finest interrogators the Ordo had ever known. Valinov had been brilliant at manipulation and infiltration, capable of drawing the most sensitive information from the wariest suspects. His work had led Barbilus to criminal empires and hidden cults, savage tribes and networks of corruption. He was marked for greatness, destined to ride at Barbilus's side as senior interrogator. Then came Agneson's hold. Barbilus descended to fight the daemon Prince Malagrim the Bloodstained, ordering his staff to launch the exterminatus if he did not return. Senior interrogator Valinov had watched from the flagship as the verdant agri-world was swallowed by magma welling up from its ruptured crust. Malagrim was destroyed. Barbilus never returned. But somewhere in that moment, watching a world burn, Valinov had changed. He had allowed Barbilus to die, perhaps even ensured it. And in the decades that followed, he had wreaked havoc across the Segmentum Solar in the name of chaos. On Virun, Valinov had drowned an entire hive world in a warp storm so localized and complete that it could only have been deliberately created. 19 billion men, women and children were swallowed by the nightmare dimension of the warp. Astropaths reported hearing screams emanating from the planet for light years around. He immolated the capital of Port St. Indra by overloading the city's heat sinks. Chaos-worshipping pirate ships wiped out a pilgrim convoy and named Valinov as their leader. He joined with plague cults formed from survivors who believed they owed their lives to chaos. The trail of atrocity stretched across the sector. The Ordo Malleus had finally cornered Valinov in a fortified asteroid in the Galvan Belt, and Alaric had been the first Grey Knight out of the boarding torpedoes. Now Valinov sat in a cell on Mimas, awaiting his sentence of 5 deaths, kept conscious through each execution by a psyker who could preserve his awareness even as his body rotted. But Valinov had possessed something far more dangerous than weapons or cultists. Among his belongings, the Inquisition had found an ancient book called the Codicium Aeternum, a mouldering tome that contained the names of thousands of daemons, along with descriptions and dates of their banishments. One entry in particular had drawn the attention of Inquisitor Ligeia, a shrewd investigator who had been brought over from the Ordo Hereticus for her exceptional skills. The entry was for Ghargatuloth. In the Fallen Dagger Hall, where Grand Master Colgano had once challenged his knights to unarmored duels, a council was convened. Grand Master Tencendor entered wearing his customized Terminator armor, his broad jaw set in a frown, his voice made gravelly by an ancient throat wound that had nearly killed him when he was still a Justicar. With him came Justicar Alaric, newly reunited with his repaired war gear. Inquisitor Nixos sat at the round table, flanked by his silent honor guard in their silvered masks. He was old and leathery, wearing simple black that served to flaunt the silver-plated brackets and servos that lent his frail body immense strength. Beside him sat Inquisitor Ligeia in impressive noble regalia, looking more like an elegant family matriarch than a hunter of daemons. She carried the Codicium Aeternum in a portable void safe to protect its delicate pages. The Codicium confirmed what the prophecies had suggested. Ghargatuloth had been banished for 1,000 years by Grand Master Mandulis, and that banishment was ending. Somewhere along the trail of St. Evissa, the Daemon Prince would return. Tensendur was reluctant to commit forces to what seemed like guesswork. The Eye of Terror had opened, Cadia was under threat, and the Grey Knights were needed at the front lines of the eternal war against chaos. But Ligeia pressed her case with quiet determination. She explained what Ghargatuloth truly was, not merely a Daemon Prince, but an avatar of knowledge itself, chosen of Sench. Every man he killed, every secret he forced from a follower, every moment of suffering he caused, he learned more and became more. When Mandulis had banished him 1,000 years ago, Ghargatuloth had been like a child compared to what he would become. 1,000 years of scheming from beyond the veil had made him stronger than ever. Tencendor relented. Alaric was given command of a strike force consisting of several Grey Knight squads. Justicar Santoro would bring his tactical squad. Justicar Genhain would provide fire support with his specialists, and Brother Captain Tancred would lead his veteran Terminators, warriors whose psychic abilities were legendary even among the Grey Knights. Their ship, the Rubicon, would carry them to the trail of St. Evissa. Before departing, Alaric visited the cell where Valinov was being held. He watched through armored glass as Ligeia attempted to interrogate the traitor. The cell was cramped, barely large enough for Valinov to stand, with an explosive collar clamped around his neck ready to detonate at the first sign of escape. Valinov was skilled at such games. He He deflected Ligeia's questions, mocked her threats, and spoke of chaos with the fervor of a true believer. The purpose of the Inquisition, Valinov said, his voice smooth and dangerous, is to ensure that the Adeptus Terra retains power. It does this by covering up the truth with tales of your dead emperor and fictions you call histories. Chaos is the essence of existence. It is power given form. It can be shaped, it can be used. Chaos could free mankind. Chaos is suffering, Ligeia replied calmly. I have seen as much of that as you have. Perspective, Inquisitor. Some must always suffer, but chaos gives so much more to those who do not. Under the Imperium, everyone suffers. Ligeia left the cell having learned nothing concrete, but Alaric sensed that Valinov was hiding something important, something connected to Ghargatuloth and the trail. The traitor's eyes had glinted with hidden amusement when the Daemon Prince's name was mentioned. The trail of St. Ivissa stretched across the galactic west, a chain of worlds linked by the ancient pilgrimage of a long-forgotten saint. Once, the trail had been a beacon of imperial piety, its cathedrals covered in gold, its festivals lasting for weeks. Each world had competed in works of devotion until processions snaked around entire continents. It rivaled the relic trail of Sebastian Thor for ostentatious piety. But over the centuries, it had fallen into decline. The wealth had dried up, the cardinals had grown corrupt, and the populations had turned to older faiths and stranger practices. It was the perfect place for corruption to take root, and Ghargatuloth had been cultivating it for 1,000 years. Ligeia's investigation led them first to the world of Sophano Secundus, a feudal planet ruled by an All-King, whose knights rode strange beasts called Thar into battle. The missionary Polonius had served the ecclesiarchy there for generations, preaching to the forest peoples and the feudal lords alike. But when Ligeia met with Polonius in his crude chapel, she noticed something strange, a book on his shelf that should not have existed. It was a copy of Mimandos's Lamentations, a religious text that had been lost for 1,200 years. No member of the ecclesiarchy should have possessed it unless they had been alive for all those centuries. The moment Ligeia challenged him, Polonius revealed his true nature. His eyes blazed with violet fire, his face becoming hollow and ancient beyond any natural lifespan, and the air grew thick with sorcerous energy. He was not Polonius at all, but a creature called Crucien, a servant of Ghargatuloth who had been waiting on Sophano Secundus for over a millennium, preparing the way for his master's return. The Rubicon lost all contact with the surface as a storm of warp energy engulfed the landing zone. From the bridge, Alaric watched as the image of Sophano Secundus was replaced by shifting static, a purple-black circle of interference boiling evilly where the capital should have been. Even from orbit, he could feel it, fingers of magic spattering against his armored soul like cold rain. There was no time for the wargear rites or ritual purification that a grey knight should undergo before battle. Ligeia was down there, and if she was not dead already, she very soon would be. Alaric led his grey knights down in Thunderhawk gunships, the engines screaming as they descended into atmosphere. They landed in a valley outside the capital, where Ligeia's death cultist Tatesi had sent a string of coordinates before all contact was lost. But it was a trap. The All-King's army had been corrupted, turned to the worship of Ghargatuloth under his guise as the Lord of Change. Thousands of knights and foot soldiers appeared on the ridges surrounding the valley, their bright colours muted in the gathering gloom, the jangling of armour and the grunt of Thar filtering down over the cold wind. A herald's voice called down from above, "Soldiers from the sky, our emperor abhors the heretics who hunt his people. The spirits of the kings long dead spit on infidel invaders. The emperor, the Lord of Change, and the Prince of 1,000 Faces rot your hearts. Your deaths are our lives." A hunting horn brayed, and the army charged. Massively muscled Thar legs powered forward, flashing armour of knights on top, streaming coloured pennants of a dozen feudal barons. Justicar Genhine bellowed an order, and storm bolter fire streaked out, bright white streaks kicking up bursts of blood, blasting bodies backward in flailing broken sprays. But more came, trampling the dead, galloping over heaps of corpses. The charge hit home. Alaric turned a lance aimed at his head with the blade of his nemesis halberd, and punched his other hand into the maw of the Thar beneath the rider, squeezing the firing stud to send bolt shells ripping through the beast. He impaled the rider on his halberd, and, without throwing the body off his blade, hacked through the rider behind him. The mass of the All-King's army was on foot, swordsmen and spearmen swarming forward. This was how Grey Knights could be lost swamped and smothered, trapped between a mountain of men until their power armor failed and their bolters ran dry. Brother Devon was dragged to the ground, a dozen men piling onto him. Clostus cut one swordsman from throat to groin. But they poured in through the breach, fearless, fanatical. It was Tancred who saved them. Leading his Terminators in a prayer of righteous hatred, he channeled their combined psychic might into the devastating power known as the Holocaust. "In hatred be strong," he roared. "In valor be sure. In vengeance be foremost." His men echoed, and white blades of light flickered around them. The psychic crescendo detonated like a bomb. A titanic burst of light ripped through the surging throng, sending a shockwave tearing through the enemy ranks. Men were blasted clean of their flesh, Thar disintegrating, a wide space scoured white of the enemy. The charge became a rout as the survivors fled, but Ligeia was gone. Crucian had taken her, spiriting her away to continue Ghargatuloth's design, and Tyetsi, the death cultist who had seemed to survive, proved to be dead all along. Warp-spawned worms burst from his skull the moment Alaric approached, his body puppeted by demonic sorcery. Brother Mikros immolated the writhing mess with holy flame. The investigation continued across the trail, but everywhere they turned, they found corruption. The cardinals had been subverted centuries ago. Ancient cults had been preparing for this moment for generations. Ghargatuloth had been manipulating events from beyond the veil of the warp for 1,000 years, moving civilizations into position like pieces on a regicide board. The trail led finally to Volcanis Ultor, a hive world dominated by manufactories and choking pollution. Deep beneath the planet's surface lay Lake Rapax, a seething pit of toxic corruption where the sins of millennia had seeped into the earth. Legends spoke of monsters roaming its depths and ghosts reaching helplessly from its oily surface, and hidden beneath the lake was the tomb of Saint Time, Evissa himself. This was where Ghargatuloth would be reborn. The Grey Knights descended into the tomb alongside the Sisters of the Bloody Rose, led by Canoness Lacrima, a warrior of unshakable faith whose power armor was adorned with the bones of saints. They fought through caverns filled with skeletal guardians and warp-twisted horrors, descending ever deeper toward the heart of the tomb. The sword of Mandulis, recovered from its resting place on Titan, was carried by Tancred himself, its blade glowing with ancient power. On the surface, the Belurian heavy infantry and the Methalor scout regiment fought a desperate holding action against cultists and daemons. Among them, wearing the uniform of an Imperial officer, was Valinov himself. He had escaped from Mimers through means unknown, and now he walked among loyal soldiers, waiting for his moment. The tomb of Saint Evissa was a nightmare of marble and bone, a skeletal city built around the saint's final resting place. The 77 screaming maskers, cultists who had transformed themselves into creatures of living pollution centuries ago, guarded every approach. They attacked with tentacles of corrosive slime that ate through even blessed Terminator armor, their eyeless faces howling with inhuman hunger. Brother Golvan fell to their assault, his armor rotted away, his flesh dissolving into the toxic mire. At the heart of the tomb stood an acropolis where Ligeia waited. But she was not the same woman who had led the investigation. Ghargatuloth had broken her mind, filled her with his essence, transformed her into the vessel through which he would return. She spoke prophecies in a voice that was not her own, recounting the doom that awaited the Imperium when the Prince of 1,000 Faces walked the stars once more. And then Valinov arrived, leading the Belurian soldiers he had deceived into the very heart of the tomb. With a word of power, he triggered the final stage of the ritual. Ligeia's body became the conduit, and Ghargatuloth began to pour into reality. The explosion tore the Acropolis apart in a tidal wave of white light. Grey Knights were thrown through the air like leaves in a hurricane. The tomb itself bulged outward with the force of the Daemon Prince's birth, shattering stone and vaporizing the 77 maskers in an instant. And then, rising from the ruins like a pillar of impossible flesh, Ghargatuloth emerged. He was vast beyond comprehension, a column of iridescent flesh several hundred meters across and a kilometer high, erupting from the earth like a volcano of living nightmare. Reality twisted and folded around him as he forced himself into dimensions that real space could not contain. Tentacles split from his mass, each one tipped with monstrous faces that leered down at the world below. The sky itself screamed as thunderheads of sorcery formed around him, spitting multicolored lightning across the plains. Across Volcanis Ultor, millions went mad. The psychic shockwave of Ghargatuloth's manifestation struck every mind on the planet, filling them with pure terror. Hatred became liquid and dripped down the walls of the hives. Suffering rolled across the plains as a cold, lethal mist. The Daemon Prince had returned, and his power was greater than it had ever been. Alaric lay broken against the shattered wall of the tomb, his armor split and torn, his bones fractured in a dozen places, and yet he was still conscious, still alive, still fighting. Because in those final moments before the ritual completed, Inquisitor Ligeia had given him a gift. She had known her mind was being invaded. She had known her fall was inevitable, and so she had left herself open, allowing Ghargatuloth's essence to flow through her, searching for the one piece of knowledge that could defeat him. In her final moments of lucidity, she had found it, and she had repeated it over and over again to her captors, hoping someone would understand. The true name of Ghargatuloth. Every daemon, no matter how powerful, has a true name. It is the word that defines their very existence, the key to their essence. A daemon's true name gives it speaker power over the creature, the ability to command it, to weaken it, even to destroy it. The true name of a daemon prince is a closely guarded secret, known only to the chaos gods themselves. But Ligeia had found it, hidden in the depths of Ghargatuloth's own mind, and Alaric had been the only one who trusted her. Now, as Ghargatuloth towered over the ruins of the tomb, as the daemon prince prepared to spread his influence across the galaxy, Alaric began to speak. The true name burned his lips. Each syllable was agony, a sound that human throats were never meant to make. But Alaric forced the words out, one after another, his faith sustaining him where his body failed. The air crackled with psychic energy as the name took effect, and Ghargatuloth's iridescent flesh began to ripple and darken. The daemon prince screamed. His 1,000 faces contorted in pain as the true name cut through his essence like a blade. Tentacles writhed and knotted around his central column. Skin flaked away in great slabs, falling to earth in a terrible hail of dead flesh. The faces beneath the surface fought to escape, crawling toward the core of Ghargatuloth's body, trying to get away from the words that were destroying them. Alaric spoke the final syllable and collapsed, his consciousness fading. But he had done enough. Ghargatuloth's massive form was falling, toppling sideways like a felled tree, crashing to earth with a sound like 1,000 deaths. The Grey Knights who survived the explosion rallied to finish what Alaric had started. Justicar led them forward, hacking at Ghargatuloth's weakened flesh with their nemesis weapons. The Balurian heavy infantry, not understanding what had happened, but knowing that the monster was vulnerable, brought up anti-tank guns and Lehman Russ battle tanks to pour fire into the daemon's body. The Sisters of the Bloody Rose added their bolt of fire and chainswords, intoning prayers of righteous wrath. Valinov met his end in the filth of Ghargatuloth's dissolving body. The daemon prince had been absorbing him, drawing him into its flesh as the ultimate reward for his devotion. But when Alaric spoke the true name, Ghargatuloth had rejected his servant, spitting him back out in a half-digested mass of agony. Alaric found what remained of the traitor writhing in the daemon's blood, his skin gone, his organs exposed, his lidless eyes rolling with madness. There was no mercy for Valinov. Alaric dragged him to the shore of Lake Rapax and held him beneath the polluted waters until he stopped struggling. It was not cruelty, but justice. The man who had killed billions, who had devoted his soul to chaos, who had betrayed everything the Inquisition stood for, died alone and forgotten in the toxic mire. By the time dawn broke over Volcanis Ultor, Ghargatuloth was nothing but a dark stain on the earth. The daemon prince had been banished once more, his essence scattered back into the warp. It would take another 1,000 years for him to reform, another millennium before he could threaten the Imperium again. The cost had been terrible. Tancred was dead, his body lost in the destruction of the tomb. Santoro and his entire squad had fallen. Canoness Lacrima and most of her sisters had given their lives. Of the Grey Knights who had descended into the tomb, only 9 remained: Henhain, Carlin, Tharn, Ondurin, Sulkin, who had lost an arm, and Alaric's own brothers Hulvarn, Devorn and Lycos. So many had died, so many could never be replaced. But they had won. Deep beneath Titan, in a secret chamber newly excavated in the catacombs, a scribe servitor sat before a blank book. Inquisitor Nixos, still recovering from wounds suffered at Valinov's execution, dictated the details of the battle for Volcanis Ultor. He recorded Ghargatuloth's elaborate plan, the corruption of the Trail of Saint Ivissa, the sacrifice of Inquisitor Ligeia, who had found the true name even as her mind was being destroyed. The book would be called the Second Codicium Aeternum. It would contain everything the Ordo Malleus had learned about Ghargatuloth, including the true name that had defeated him. When the Daemon Prince attempted to return in another 1,000 years, the Grey Knights would be ready. Alaric travelled to Mimas one final time, to the cell where Ligeia had died. There was nothing left but a clamp bored into the rock where her restraints had been fixed. Her body had been cremated and scattered in orbit, as was fitting for a traitor. No one had said prayers for her soul. Alaric said them now. It was not much, just a few sacred words against the horror of what she had endured. But she deserved that much. In the end, Ligeia had been the one who saved them all, the one who found the weapon that defeated Ghargatuloth. Her sacrifice would be remembered, even if her name was struck from Imperial records. The fight against chaos would never be over. Alaric knew that. Ghargatuloth was banished, not destroyed, and there were countless other daemons waiting in the warp for their chance to break through into reality. The Grey Knights would go on fighting, generation after generation, holding the line against horrors that the rest of humanity could never know existed. But sometimes the fight could be won. That was why the Grey Knights existed. That was why they trained and prayed and died in the Emperor's name. Not because victory was certain, but because it was possible. Alaric looked out over the barren surface of Mimas, Saturn's vast disk glowing overhead, and allowed himself a moment of peace. The daemon was defeated. His brothers were avenged. And somewhere in the depths of Titan, the Second Codicium Aeternum was being written, ensuring that when Ghargatuloth returned, humanity would be ready. The Emperor protects. And so our tale comes to its close, though the story of Justicar Alaric is far from over. He would face other horrors in the years to come, other daemon princes and chaos cults and nightmares from beyond the veil. But he would face them as a Grey Knight, with faith in his heart and a nemesis weapon in his hand. In the grim darkness of the far future, there is only war. But there are also heroes like Alaric and Ligeia and Mandulis and all the others who gave their lives to hold back the darkness. Their names are recorded in the archives of Titan, their deeds remembered by those who follow in their footsteps. May you rest well, knowing that such warriors watch over humanity. May their vigilance grant you peaceful dreams, and may the Emperor protect you, now and always, until the stars themselves grow cold.